This is a breaking and developing situation right now on Capitol Hill. As we come on air, something irreversible has already begun. A former special counsel of the United States Department of Justice, the man who led the criminal investigations into Donald Trump, is sitting behind closed doors with House Republicans. This is not a briefing. This is not a courtesy appearance. This is a sworn deposition conducted under congressional authority, targeting the most consequential criminal investigations ever brought against a former president. And what makes this moment historic is not the room or the secrecy or even the politics surrounding it. What makes it unprecedented is that the prosecutor at the center of those cases has now placed his conclusions directly on the record again, under oath, in front of lawmakers who are openly hostile to the investigations he led. This is not background. This is not history. This is happening now. And the machinery of accountability has started moving in a way that cannot be reversed. Okay, so I've been covering politics for a long time now, and I thought I had seen everything. I thought after all the scandals and the lawsuits and the investigations and the impeachments, I thought nothing could shock me anymore. But what I'm about to tell you genuinely made my jaw drop when I first read about it, because we're not talking about financial fraud here. We're not talking about classified documents or hush money payments or any of the usual Trump controversies. We're talking about potential war crimes, actual war crimes, the kind of thing. What we are watching right now is the early stage of a convergence, two forces closing in, not sequentially, simultaneously. Former Justice Department Special Counsel Jack Smith arrived on Capitol Hill earlier today and entered a closed-door deposition with members of the House Judiciary Committee. This deposition is part of an ongoing Republican-led investigation into the criminal inquiries brought against Donald Trump during the Biden administration. On its face, that sounds like political oversight. In reality, it is something much more dangerous and much more revealing. Jack Smith is not a witness to a peripheral event. He is the architect of two federal indictments against a former president, one tied to efforts to overturn the 2020 election and obstruct the lawful transfer of power, the other tied to the willful retention of highly classified national defense documents at Mar-a-Lago after Trump left office. Those facts are not disputed. They are already part of the public record. What changes today is that Smith did not come in quietly. Despite efforts by House Republicans to keep this deposition entirely out of public view, Smith delivered an opening statement, and thanks to confirmed reporting, we now know what he told them. That opening statement is the reason this moment matters, and it is the reason this story is not going away. Smith stated clearly and without qualification that his investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election and to prevent the lawful transfer of power. That phrase is not rhetorical. It is legal, and it is deliberate. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is not the standard required to bring charges. It is the standard required to convict at trial. By using that language, Smith was not defending his past decisions. He was placing a marker. He was saying under oath that the evidence exceeded the threshold needed to indict. That matters because it reframes every claim that these prosecutions were speculative, political, or premature. This is the first force closing in. Smith also reaffirmed that his investigation uncovered powerful evidence showing that Donald Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after leaving office in January 2021, not abstract documents, not paperwork misfiled in an office, classified materials stored at Mar-a-Lago, including in a bathroom, a ballroom, and other areas where public events and gatherings took place. Those locations matter, intent matters, and willfulness matters. This was not a dispute over record keeping. It was an allegation of criminal conduct involving national security material. And here is where the closed-door nature of this deposition becomes part of the story itself. There is no public video. There is no live broadcast. The American people are not hearing Smith's testimony directly. That is not an accident. Republican committee leadership chose to block public testimony, despite allowing other special counsels to testify openly in the past. That decision alone tells you how high the stakes are. But even behind closed doors, Smith did not retreat. He addressed January 6th directly directly, he explained that his team established how Trump and his associates exploited the violence at the Capitol by attempting to contact members of Congress during the attack, urging them to delay certification of the election. This was not speculation. It was documented coordination. Investigators did not rely on wiretaps. They used telephone billing records. Those records mapped who was calling whom and when during the critical hours of January 6th, a roadmap of communication between the White House and members of Congress constructed from Trump's own actions. Smith made a point of saying he did not choose which members of Congress were contacted. Trump did. The evidence followed Trump's decisions. That distinction matters because it destroys the claim that prosecutors manufactured a narrative or targeted political enemies. This brings us back to the convergence. On one side, you have congressional Republicans attempting to reframe federal prosecutions as partisan abuse. On the other, you have a former special counsel reaffirming under oath that his cases were built on evidence meeting the highest legal standard in American criminal law. Those forces are moving toward the same target at the same time. This is not the first time Jack Smith has spoken publicly about these cases. When the election interference indictment was unsealed, Smith stood before the public and explained the charges. He described the January 6th attack as an unprecedented assault on American democracy, fueled by lies aimed at obstructing the government's constitutional process of certifying a presidential election. He praised law enforcement officers who defended the Capitol and framed the case as part of the Justice Department's commitment to accountability. That framing matters now because today's deposition reinforces it rather than contradicting it, and Smith has not hidden from scrutiny. Knowing he would be subpoenaed, he previously sat for a lengthy interview with Andrew Weissmann, discussing his work and his experience inside the Department of Justice. In that interview, Smith rejected the idea that politics played a role in his decisions and emphasized that prosecutors follow rules, not desired outcomes. He stated plainly that retaliatory prosecutions are the real threat to democracy, not lawful accountability, which brings us to the second force closing in. Democratic lawmakers on the Judiciary Committee, including Ranking Member Jamie Raskin, have openly questioned why Republicans refused to make Smith's testimony public. Raskin argued that public testimony would have been devastating to Trump and his allies and suggested that Smith spent hours explaining the professional and ethical responsibilities of prosecutors to the committee. Raskin also pointed out something critical. Other special counsels have testified publicly. Robert Mueller did, Robert Hur did. Blocking Smith is an aberration. And that raises the question this story keeps circling back to. If this testimony helps Trump, why hide it? This is not about optics anymore. It is about institutional credibility. It is about whether the legal system enforces limits on power or whether power successfully intimidates the system into silence. Two forces are now in motion. Congressional pressure, legal accountability, they are converging, and this is only the beginning. To understand why this moment matters, you have to strip away the noise and look at how institutions actually behave when they are under stress, not what politicians say on television, not what partisans claim on social media. What matters is process, authority, and incentives, and right now, multiple institutions are being pulled in opposite directions by the same individual. This is the convergence. Force number one is Congress, specifically the House Judiciary Committee and related Republican-led committees that have taken it upon themselves to investigate the investigators. On paper, that authority is real. Congress has the constitutional power to conduct oversight, to compel testimony, and to examine how executive agencies operate, but oversight has rules. And motive matters. This deposition of Jack Smith was not designed to gather neutral information. It was designed to undermine the legitimacy of the prosecutions against Donald Trump. That is not an opinion. That conclusion is supported by public statements from committee leadership, repeated calls to prosecute Smith himself, and an explicit effort to keep his testimony hidden from public view. If the goal were transparency, the testimony would be public. If the goal were accountability, the record would be released promptly. Instead, the strategy is control. Control the room. Control the transcript. Control the narrative drip. That is the first institutional force at work. But here's the problem for Congress. Jack Smith does not work for them. He does not answer to them in the way an agency head might. His authority came from the Department of Justice, and his work is already embedded in the judicial system through grand jury indictments. Congress can question him. They cannot undo what has already been charged, and Smith made that boundary explicit in his testimony. He stated that the decision to bring charges against Donald Trump was his alone, not the White House's, not the Attorney General's, not a political party's, his. But he also made something else unmistakably clear. The basis for those charges rests entirely with Trump's own actions, as alleged in indictments returned by grand juries in 2 different federal districts. That is not rhetorical framing, that is institutional insulation. By grounding his decisions in grand jury findings, Smith shifted responsibility away from himself and back onto the system. Grand juries are citizens. They are not political appointees. They operate independently, and once they return indictments, those charges exist outside the control of Congress. This is where the second force comes into focus, the judiciary. Every allegation Smith discussed already lives inside active or completed judicial proceedings. Judges reviewed evidence, warrants were approved, indictments were returned, appeals courts are involved, and in the classified documents case, the release of Smith's final report is now tied to decisions by Judge Aileen Cannon and potentially the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. That matters because Congress cannot override the courts. They can complain, they can posture, they can threaten investigations, but they cannot erase judicial records or rewrite legal findings. Smith reinforced this separation when he addressed accusations of partisanship. He stated under oath that he made his decisions without regard to Trump's political affiliation, beliefs, activities, or candidacy in the 2024 election. He went further. He said he would have made the exact same decisions if Trump had been a Democrat or a Republican. That statement is not designed to persuade voters. It is designed to protect the integrity of the process. It creates a record, and records are what courts rely on. This is why the closed-door deposition backfired. By forcing Smith into a sworn setting, Republicans did not weaken his credibility. They strengthened it. Every answer becomes testimony. Every clarification becomes part of an official record that can be referenced, quoted, and compared against future claims. This is how institutions constrain each other. Now look at the second institutional force in more detail, the Department of Justice itself. Smith no longer works there. That matters. He is not defending a current administration. He is defending work already completed. And that work produced 2 major outputs, criminal indictments and a multi-volume special counsel report. Volume 1, covering election interference, has already been released. When read alongside the findings of the January 6th committee, it creates a consistent narrative, different bodies, different mandates, same core conclusions about Trump's conduct. Volume 2, covering classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, has not yet been released, and that absence is now part of the pressure campaign. Republicans want to control the narrative before that document becomes public. Democrats want it released to reinforce the case that Trump's conduct met criminal thresholds. Courts will ultimately decide when and how it becomes available. Again, convergence, congressional pressure on one side, judicial process on the other, and Trump sits in the middle. This is why the idea of prosecuting Jack Smith is not just rhetorical, it is strategic. Trump has openly called for Smith to be investigated and prosecuted, not for misconduct supported by evidence, but for doing his job. That demand serves 2 purposes. First, it intimidates future prosecutors. Second, it reframes accountability as retaliation. Smith addressed this directly in earlier public remarks and interviews. He warned that the real danger is not prosecuting powerful figures when evidence warrants it. The real danger is using prosecution as punishment for doing lawful work. That warning is no longer abstract. It is playing out in real time. And the media environment is now split into 2 competing campaigns. One side, led by Republican committee chairs, will selectively release excerpts of the deposition transcript. Carefully chosen lines, friendly interpretations, delayed disclosures, no video, no full context. The other side consists of Smith's legal team and allied voices ensuring that his statements are accurately conveyed, contextualized, and preserved. Public reporting, legal filings, court records. This is not about who wins a news cycle. It is about which version of reality survives institutional scrutiny. And here is the part many people miss. Public opinion is no longer the primary battlefield. The audience that matters now is the judiciary, appellate courts, trial courts, future prosecutors, inspectors general, historians. These institutions operate on documents, sworn testimony, and consistency. Smith's deposition adds weight to his prior actions. It does not replace them, which brings us back to the central threat frame. Two forces closing in. Congress is attempting to discredit and deter accountability. The legal system is continuing to process evidence and consequences. They are not moving in sequence. They are moving at the same time. Every attempt to suppress testimony becomes evidence of fear. Every sworn reaffirmation strengthens the record, and this feedback loop accelerates the crisis rather than resolving it. This is no longer about whether Trump was investigated. It is about whether institutions still function when the subject of investigation is powerful enough to fight back. That question is now unavoidable. At this stage, the story stops being about politics entirely. What we are dealing with now is legal gravity. Once sworn testimony, judicial findings, and institutional records align, momentum builds in ways no single actor can control. This is where escalation becomes unavoidable. The third force entering this convergence is the legal system beyond Congress, not hearings, not press conferences, courts, appeals, constitutional thresholds, and in the background, international legal norms that the United States helped design. Start with the domestic legal framework. Jack Smith's testimony does not exist in isolation. It connects directly to indictments returned by grand juries in 2 federal districts. Those indictments triggered judicial oversight at multiple levels. Judges reviewed charging documents. Courts ruled on motions. Appellate pathways opened. Once a prosecutor states under oath that evidence met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that statement becomes relevant far beyond Congress. Defense attorneys analyze it. Judges consider it. Appellate courts note consistency or deviation from prior representations. This matters because legal systems do not reset with elections. Trump's political status does not erase judicial records. Congressional control does not dissolve grand jury findings. Public fatigue does not nullify constitutional obligations. Now add the classified documents case. The alleged willful retention of national defense information at Mar-a-Lago is not a procedural dispute. It is a national security issue governed by statutes that apply regardless of office held. Location matters, access matters, intent matters. Storing classified material in a bathroom, a ballroom, or event spaces where guests and staff circulated creates exposure risk. That is not interpretation. That is how classification law works. Volume 2 of the Special Counsel report addresses this directly. Its delayed release has become part of the escalation because delay does not erase content. It simply compresses attention when disclosure eventually happens. Judges do not evaluate politics. They evaluate records, which brings us to the constitutional layer. The events surrounding January 6th implicate the peaceful transfer of power. That is not a partisan norm. It is a constitutional function. Smith's cases allege a scheme to obstruct that function. Courts take that seriously because it strikes at the design of the system itself. The Constitution anticipates ambition. It anticipates bad actors. It does not assume good faith. That is why it disperses power across branches and embeds checks that activate when norms collapse. This is one of those moments. Congress is attempting to reassert dominance over the accountability process. The judiciary is asserting independence. The executive branch, through past DOJ actions, has already acted. No single branch controls the outcome. This is why Trump's options narrow rather than expand. He cannot retroactively erase indictments. He cannot order courts to disregard sworn testimony. He cannot compel grand juries to rescind findings. Every attempt to do so creates more evidence of obstruction or abuse. Now layer in the international dimension. When Smith referenced conduct that approached potential war crimes in earlier framing, he was not being rhetorical. International law does not care about domestic political immunity. Actions involving the misuse of state power, the incitement of violence, or the abuse of authority intersect with international legal norms when they threaten democratic stability or involve state actors. The United States has historically positioned itself as an enforcer of these norms. That creates an uncomfortable mirror. If the system fails to enforce accountability at home, its credibility abroad erodes. That is not theoretical. It affects extradition, sanctions, diplomatic leverage. The International Criminal Court exists precisely because domestic systems sometimes fail. Now, Trump is not currently before the ICC. That is not the point. The point is that global legal architecture watches how powerful democracies police themselves. This is why Smith's language matters. By grounding allegations in evidence and process rather than rhetoric, he positioned the cases inside universally recognized legal frameworks. That limits the ability to dismiss them as political vendettas internationally, and this is where convergence accelerates. Congressional attempts to suppress testimony create transparency